Okay, and I think we're live. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for the second episode for our season 3 of The Future of Foraging. And today we're going to be talking about the consequences and challenges of group foraging, which seems like a very interesting topic. So today we have 2 speakers who will introduce shortly. But I'm Laura. I'm a postdoc in Josh Dudman's lab at Genelia. And we have a couple of our co-organizers here today as well. Dennis and Rory.
Yes.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Dennis, and I am in the metabolism lab of Carlos Ribeiro in Lisbon.
Hi, I'm Rory, also in the behaviour and
And we have a special guest panelist today, Dean.
Hi, I'm Dean Rance. I'm in the Mathematics of Behavior and Intelligence lab at Champollion. I'm looking at collective behavior with zebrafish.
Great. And we have our 2 speakers today, Sasha Dall and Damien Farine, who Sasha's going to go first today. So I'm going to, just to give everyone who's watching like a little idea of the format very briefly, I'm going to introduce Sasha formally, and then he's going to give his talk. We'll have a 5-minute Q&A for Sasha's talk, and then it'll be Damien's talk plus a 5-minute Q&A, and then we'll have a round table at the end. So for now, the first thing I need to do is to actually sort of close everyone else out. And Sasha, if you can share your slides, and I will. So yes, I'm very pleased to introduce Professor Sasha Dall. So during Sasha's PhD at the University of Bristol, he worked on foraging theory, in particular the predator-prey problem. And he then took up research fellowships at Florida State University, at the Ben Gurion University in Israel, and subsequently a research associate position at the University of Cambridge. And these were all very productive times for him as he expanded his work into behavioural and evolutionary ecology across multiple species, including zebra finches and gerbils. He then took up a lectureship at Exeter in 2005, where he has remained since, and he's now an associate professor and senior lecturer of theoretical biology there. A real unifying theme in his work is how organisms deal with uncertainty, and with more recent focus on the evolutionary ecology of individual differences and personality, as well as game theory, animal culture, and social information use. But what I think makes his work, from my reading at least, stand out really is that his continued careful and insightful approach to theory and analysis, sort of regardless of the specific question being asked. So we're very excited to hear Sasha talk today. And yeah, thank you.
Many thanks, Laura. That was a bit, it's kind of always weird to hear your career recited back to you. It makes you think, well, maybe I am doing some good stuff. Anyway, okay, so my name is Sasha Dall, and this is going to be a theory-focused talk. And as Laura said, I started my life out, my academic life out studying foraging. So, it's a real honor to be invited to talk at kind of a foraging focused series. However, I mean, I've kind of moved away from foraging as a kind of exclusive focus, and now I kind of focus a lot on decision making in general in lots of different contexts. But for the purpose of this talk, I mean, I am going to be talking about 2 models that can be thought of in a foraging context, because they're really focusing on the exploiting resources. And what I'm going to be particularly focusing on is how social contexts really need to be carefully thought about when you're thinking, or when you're studying animals exploiting resources and they live socially. You need to think very carefully about the kind of impacts of social interactions on the kind of fundamental drivers of behavior. Now, I'm going to be, Alex Koselnik, in your introductory lecture, gave you a kind of good introduction to the kind of the philosophy underlying most of my work, and that is kind of taking a kind of a formal approach to hypothesizing about adaptation, or trying to predict from kind of ecological first principles the kinds of strategies you expect to see animals adopting if their behavior has been selected for. And so we borrow in the field of in the kind of the theoretical world that I live in. We borrow mathematical tools from economics. We've borrowed utility theory that was kind of some of the first theoretical approaches that were taken in behavioral ecology to understand optimal foraging, and and then more recently things have become a bit more focused in in a kind of game theoretic context. So optimal foraging, where basically you are trying to analyze how animals should be responding to environments that are relatively simple. The environment itself is not evolving. You can set the environment and ask what the best thing to do is. It's been incredibly successful. Alex gave you kind of a bit of an insight into that, and it's being adopted by a wide range of fields, including all the way to neuroscience and things like that. So and in textbooks, this is just a kind of a figure from a very prominent ecological textbook, Begon, Townsend, and Harper. And they cite the optimal diet model, which is one of the classic optimal foraging models, as the most successful formal theoretical model in ecology. And it's been incredibly good at predicting, predicting the economics, the kind of economic aspects of how animals look for food. But it's not been perfect. And there are many things that it doesn't capture, and there's a lot of variation in animal kind of foraging behavior that it doesn't capture. And one of the things that struck everybody is that actually the world is rarely all that simple, in the sense that often the important environment that the animal faces is kind of controlled by other organisms, affected by their decisions, and so you're going to get some coevolution. And game theory is a kind of formal approach that allows you to analyze what the best thing to do is, the thing that will optimize some sort of currency, ultimately related to fitness, when you've got this kind of co-evolutionary structure to your world. So I've talked about this in terms of the world biting back. John Maynard Smith was kind of the person who introduced the economic approach, this economic approach of game theory to evolutionary biology in the 70s. And it really, the focus is that what you're trying to do is hypothesize about the kinds of strategies that are going to be stable against invasion by competing strategies, in that there's not going to be any evolutionary incentive for alternative strategies to do well in the population. So it analyzes situations where the payoffs depend on others. It also, another factor that wasn't really incorporated in classic optimal foraging theory is that almost everything that organisms face is kind of plagued by uncertainty. And in social context, that uncertainty a major source of that uncertainty can come from the strategic decisions that the individuals that you're interacting with also make. And so what I hope I'm going to convince you today is that by incorporating both of these things into thinking carefully about the kinds of problems animals might face when they're exploiting resources in social context, can have really important impacts on the kind of behavior that you might predict in a more real world setting than the kind of classic optimal foraging context. So I'm going to start by the first case study I'm going to talk through to kind of illustrate this. Will come from the classic evolutionary game that Maynard Smith and Price introduced, the hawk-dove game, and it really models a situation where when you get into in a social context, what often happens when you're trying to exploit resources and there are other individuals around, you often get into fights over those resources. So the hawk-dove game is a kind of model that you can think of it as a model of contest competition. And just to refresh your memory, apologies for those of you that are familiar with the hawk-dove game, but it's important, I think, to reiterate the basics of this. Individuals in this game are competing for a resource, which has a fitness value of V. Okay, and in any given interaction, an individual can adopt a hawk strategy in which they can kind of escalate or aggressively attempt to gain access to the resource, or they can adopt a more dovish strategy action, which is they will share a resource if there's another dove there, but if they're kind of threatened by a hawk, they'll back down. And the rules of the game are that hawks beat doves. So if a hawk meets a dove, the dove will retreat. If you get two hawks playing or two doves playing, then you win half the time and you lose half the time. So in a sense, you kind of share the resource. So in other words, individuals do not differ from each other in any way other than the strategy that they are playing, the actions they're taking. But there is a difference in that situation if you're the loser in an interaction. If you're a loser and you're a hawk, you suffer a fitness cost C, so the cost of getting into extended fights and losing them. While if you're a dove and you've lost, you don't suffer any sort of cost. So the way we typically analyze these things is you kind of can think of the focal, and you can kind of extract any given individual. They are all identical other than the actions that they take, and the focal individual is the one whose payoffs I'm going to be illustrating in this matrix. And you've got the focal individual here as a row player, and it can be hawk or dove, and it plays against an opponent and who can adopt a hawk strategy or a dove strategy. So when a hawk plays a hawk, half the time it wins and gains resource V, half the time it loses and suffers the cost C. Okay, so that's the expected payoff you get from playing against a hawk. If you're a hawk and you play against a dove, then you always win. If you're a dove and you play against a hawk, you never win. And if you're a dove and you play against a dove, you win half the time and you lose half the time. So this is your expected payoff if you come up against another dove. And so you can analyze this to work out what the evolutionary stable strategy is. I'm not going to go through that because we don't really have time to go through all of that. But basically, the result from doing a kind of an evolutionarily stable strategy analysis, when you look for the right particular type of Nash equilibrium, if anybody's kind of more formally, then if V, the relationship between V and C is crucial in terms of what you expect to evolve. If V is less than C, so in other words, fights are particularly costly, then you end up with a mixed ESS. And that means that you expect at equilibrium to have a proportion V over C playing hawk and a proportion 1 minus V over C playing dove. And that's because with V over C, hawk is not the best payoff you can get. There's an incentive to be a dove because the net payoff is negative. And if you've got dove in the population, then there's an incentive to play hawk because V is greater than V over 2. So the equilibrium outcome is somewhere in between the extremes of pure hawks and pure doves in the strategy. Okay, that's all very well. That's nice. It's an interesting, simple model of aggressive interactions. It captures something nice in that we typically see in fighting situations. We don't always see everybody just kind of fighting willy-nilly. We get some individuals backing down, some individuals playing aggression. So you get a kind of realistic outcome. But the basic game, there are two possibilities really if you drill down. The basic game doesn't distinguish between the two. So you can have the basic outcome, the basic analysis is consistent with the fact that you have a population that's a mixture of extreme types. So you've got a proportion V over C hawks and a proportion 1 minus V over C doves, all who are playing consistent hawks or playing consistent doves. Or you can basically have a population of individuals that are identical, but they're tossing a coin every single time and they're playing hawk with probability V over C. The basic model has no reason to expect the former over the latter. And actually, the randomized strategy, the monomorphic randomized strategy is pretty unrealistic. We just don't see animals make decisions in that kind of probabilistic way. So, and interestingly, when you make the model a bit more real world, so if you make the population finite and basically allow for the conditions to kind of fluctuate, weak selection pressures will cause an equilibrium of pure types to collapse to the kind of randomized monomorphic unrealistic outcome. So the question is, what can favor kind of non-randomized, the more realistic outcome where individuals are kind of playing behaviors, are controlling their behaviors in ways that we typically observe animals doing, where they're doing things differently from each other and not randomized. Well, the basic hawk-dove game focuses on pairwise agonistic interactions, but fights will commonly have interesting bystanders who can base their decisions on what they observe. And also, they will do this because often individuals are getting into repeated fights, and the kind of exact ecological conditions and the exact composition of the groups they're in will be varying. And so paying attention to what individuals are doing around them can pay. So information use can pay, simple forms of information use can pay. And so a population of individuals, so what we do is we can think of populations of individuals to model this kind of outcome, this kind of more realistic outcome. We can think of a population of individuals engaged in pairwise fights over a large number of rounds. In each round, members of the population are paired at random, and each pair plays a bout of the hawk-dove game. The fitness of an individual in this population is measured as its long-term average payoff per round, and individuals may adjust their behavior according to whether their current opponent won or lost in the previous round. So basically, you've got a very simple form of information use. You're just basing your decision based on what you saw your current opponent do in its previous fight, or the outcome of your current opponent's previous fight. The strategy then becomes a little bit more complicated. It must specify the probability of playing hawk when facing a winner, and then when facing a loser. So we call that P, the probability of playing a hawk against a winner, and Q, probability of playing a hawk against a loser. So then you can think of a strategy in terms of its aggression. You can think of its average level of aggression, so P plus Q divided by 2, so against a randomly chosen opponent, or in terms of its social sensitivity, so how much does it bias its hawkishness to either winners or losers. And this index means that you get a positive value if they're biasing, if Q is bigger than P, so in other words, if they're higher probability of playing hawk against a loser than a winner, and it's 0 if there's no bias, no sensitivity at all. So you then can add evolutionary dynamics. So strategy types that are made up of aggressiveness and social sensitivity can change in frequency in proportion to their payoff relative to the population mean payoff. This allows us to describe short-term dynamics of the current set of types under the influence of selection. To investigate long-term evolution, we need to allow for new strategies to arise by mutation. And so what we do is, for simplicity, we allow for no more than one mutant type per generation at relatively low frequency, and this occurs with probability n. Types that drop below this threshold frequency are assumed to be lost from the population. And the result, when we do this, is that the evolutionarily stable outcome, or one of the two evolutionarily stable outcomes, the kind of unrealistic randomized monomorphic outcome where everybody's just playing hawk with probability V over C, it remains an ESS in this extended game, but it's no longer dynamically stable. Because if you introduce an arbitrary small degree of inter-individual variation in aggressiveness, this is sufficient to favor eavesdropping. In other words, becoming socially sensitive. So any mutant strategy that has a little bit more social sensitivity, in other words, starts biasing its hawkishness towards losers rather than winners, will be favored over the existing strategy. And this is because they are able to anticipate the behavior of their opponents. If there are differences, if there are kind of differences on average in the degree to which an individual is likely to play hawk, then more aggressive individuals, the more hawkish individuals, are going to be more likely to win their fights. Because if you play hawk, you win half the time against hawks, and you always win against doves. So it's consequently it's best to play hawk less often against winners than against losers, since the former are going to respond aggressively, which will lead you to a costly fight and a negative payoff on average. Invasion of eavesdropping strategies, in other words, for where you've got increasing social sensitivity, leads to selection for greater consistency in behavior, because if you've got a tendency to play hawk, you should become more hawkish, because individuals are out there, eavesdroppers out there, that are going to be predicting your behavior and rolling over and giving you a payoff. So it encourages you to be more hawkish, but then by frequency dependence, if everything gets more hawkish, then it also pays a proportion of individuals to get more dovish too. And consequently, eavesdroppers will not take over the population entirely, since they're unable to predict each other's behavior. But their presence favors greater inter-individual variation in aggressiveness amongst non-eavesdropping types. Okay, so what this does is this feedback leads to the other dynamically stable outcome, where basically you've got a mixture of hawks that always, their probability of playing hawk is 1 against everybody. Eavesdroppers, they never play hawk against winners and they only play hawk against losers. And doves, where they never play hawk at all. And this is illustrated in this output from a simulation, evolutionary simulation. You've got starting in the top left-hand panel here, and basically this is the monomorphic situation. This is a kind of a couple of thousand generations time. You see individuals, the proportion of individuals. So this is P on this axis, on the x-axis, Q on the z-axis, and the proportion on the y-axis. And basically you see individuals that basically the population moves from being in this kind of mixed ESS unrealistic outcome, and it moves to the corners where everybody is either a hawk, an eavesdropper, or a dove. Okay, and this is driven by this feedback. You can see that the bottom curve here is the variance in aggressiveness, that goes up in lockstep with the mean social sensitivity, which is the upper curve. So the basic hawk-dove game can't account for the evolution of realistic kind of individual differences in aggressiveness. In a social context, however, any small amount of variation in aggression, however slight, is sufficient to favor some level of eavesdropping, which favors greater variation, which favors more eavesdropping. And once an individual develops a reputation for aggressiveness, it pays to persist with the strategy. And conversely, once an individual develops a reputation for timidity, it doesn't pay to deviate from this tactic because of negative frequency dependence. This also more generally shows you how uncertainty and information use in social contexts can have profound impacts on patterns of behavior. This is an evolutionary impact, and we've got a very simple form of information use, but we can think about more complicated forms of social information use in general, and learning is one such thing. It's taxonomically widespread, and you're likely to see it in resource use games because they're often played repeatedly. They're not just played once, and ecological conditions vary. So what happens when you add learning, and what kinds of outcomes do you get when you have learning in these kind of resource use outcomes? Now, I've just noticed that I am probably not going to be able to get through this second model in any detail. So I'm just going to briefly flick through without saying too much about it. You can ask me questions about it later. But the point is that when you put it in a context, in a common foraging context, in this case, we've got a producer-scrounger game, which is a kind of collective parasitic game. This is where food is found, and you get some individuals in the population when you're in social context coming in to steal food off the others. It has negatively frequency dependent payoffs, so that the more common a strategy is, the lower the payoffs are relative to the other strategy. That's illustrated in this graph here. So that when producers, which go and find food, when there are lots of producers, then they're not getting food nicked off them, and so they get higher payoffs. But it also very high payoffs come to scroungers. The opportunity then is for individuals that don't bother looking for food, they can go and nick the food off them. So what we did is we added reinforcement learning to this, so that the actions are controlled by action value learning, which is kind of similar to, which is based on Rescorla-Wagner conditioning, so that your likelihood of playing a particular action is based on the payoffs that you got the last time you played that action. So you get this kind of reinforcement. We put it on networks. We've got two different types of networks here, and basically the kind of result that we got, and I'll just kind of summarize it here quickly, is that these are the kind of, down here at the bottom of this screen, you've got the kind of trajectories that you get under action value learning on these kind of small networks. Basically, this is a group of 21 individuals, but the network of interaction is with only 4 other individuals. And what happens is, initially, the blue individual, or the green individual, and you've got an orange individual. The green individual and orange individuals choose their strategies to produce randomly. They're 50% chance. But as soon as one of them chooses to produce, for example, it changes the payoffs, the kind of reinforcement that individuals will get from playing the alternative because of the negative frequency dependence. So if somebody produces, it makes scrounging more valuable to somebody, to the other individuals it's interacting with. That then encourages them to play scrounge, which then increases the value of playing produce to the focal individual. And this feeds back on itself, and you get these kind of outcomes where you get individuals, after many rounds of learning, they'll be polarized into only or almost never producing and almost always producing. And basically these we can look at how the development of this polarization, and it's influenced by two main things. Basically, how tight the network is. If you've got a very small neighborhood, then this feedback, this negative frequency dependence in the payoffs is very strong. And if you learn quickly, the polarization develops quickly. So this is asocial learning. So it's only paying attention to the rewards that an individual gets from its actions. It's not learning, it's not observing others in any way. And this the dynamic that initial arbitrary choices of actions can increase the value of the alternative to neighbors. This reinforces the value of the original action. And so this leads to polarization, and it's strongest when you've got small, tight interaction networks and faster learning. So in other words, the consequences, when the value of doing things, when you've got a reward, how quickly does that change your behavior? And it also turns out there are evolutionary consequences in that biases are likely to evolve. So biases in the degree to which you value the different, how much the returns that you get from particular action is valued. You tend to get biases such that producing, for example, is getting a reward from producing is less valuable than getting a reward from scrounging. Don't have time to explain how this evolves, but the key thing, I guess, to take away from that from that analysis is that you've got paying attention to this feedback in social contexts with the value of when there's uncertainty, with the value of doing something, and how that influences the value to others can lead to this very strong patterning of behavior. So predictions about what individuals should be doing when you go out and watch them in the real world. And this is true developmentally. I've just talked you through briefly the kind of learning outcome, but it also acts evolutionarily in that once you've got patterning of behavior and once individuals can vary in what they do, you can get these feedbacks that I described in the hawk-dove game. Okay, thank you very much. Well, briefly, I'll just mention the team of people who've helped me over the years with a lot of this work: John McNamara, Ola Lamar, and Alistair Houston, and Rufus Johnson. I don't have a picture of him up, but Rufus Johnson at the University of Cambridge too. Okay, thank you very much. Got time for a few questions.
Hi, Sasha. Thank you. That was excellent. Really interesting. Really interesting work. And we haven't had any questions just yet, but I was wondering a little bit about the interplay with the environment as well. So of course, everything you've spoken about here, as I would hope, is to do with sort of individual interactions with other individuals based on their own sort of baseline preferences that can change over time. I'm just kind of curious, for example, this is a very broad question, I understand, but in a particularly sparse environment, or in a especially in the sort of producer-scrounger context, for example, I'm just sort of wondering how those interactions might also bias groups of individuals to be sort of more on one end of the spectrum or the other. Perhaps that's a naive question, I'm sorry. But
no. I mean, if I may, I mean, it's so the ecological context, when you make these kind of models more ecologically complete, so you model the distribution of resources and stuff, what you find is that they really affect the fundamental parameters at the heart of the basic games. So for the hawk-dove game, the value of the resource and the costs of getting into fights can depend on how common the resource is. If the resource isn't very common, then V is going to be pretty big. Okay, so you might get more aggression, because if V gets greater than C, then you predict everybody to be aggressive. Actually, similarly with the producer-scrounger, the more common the resources are, the more valuable, the easier it is to find, for producers to find food, and so therefore actually it's easier to scrounge. I mean, the value of scrounging goes up quite high. So it does influence those kind of basic things, which will feed back into the feedback mechanisms that I talked about. So they can change the dynamics of reaching those kind of equilibrium conditions where you've got the strong patterning of behavior.
That makes a lot of sense. Thank you. We've also had a question from Paul Van Ags, who asks, have producer-scrounger games been tested or validated in humans or human behavior, for example?
Ooh. But I'm not the best person to talk to ask that question about the human side of things. I mean, so the producer-scrounger games are one of the better tested, empirically tested games in non-human systems. There's been a lot of work done, valid, where they've shown that the kind of basic predictions hold. Like there are certain parameters that really influence things, like the degree to which you get a finder's advantage. So how much an individual when they find food, how much of that chunk of food, that patch, can they exploit quickly before anybody else turns up? That has a real effect. So it's been shown, although, in lots of different scenarios. I did go to a meeting a few years back where we had a bunch of economists, and it was run by Luc-Alain Giraldin, who's famous for doing a lot of the kind of producer-scrounger experiments on animals. And the whole theme was, how does the producer-scrounger game apply? And I don't know, my impression was that the economists felt that it was something that reflected stuff that they knew about, but I didn't get a sense of how good the data were on, and whether how many experiments have been done, rather than looking at just kind of correlational kind of data. But yes, I mean, the idea was that the kind of basics of that kind of exploitation dynamic, that producing exploitation dynamic, does seem to be something that economists feel quite comfortable in applying to humans. Sorry, that's not a great answer because I just don't know, I'm afraid.
No, sorry. No, I think that does. It's interesting if economists have also, been interested in applying it as well. I mean, that does kind of. And I think we have time for one last question. This is from Rory, who says, "Great talk. Perhaps your last answer does cover this a little bit, but he's curious about, so you mentioned the polarization of strategies in the producer-scrounger game, sort of reminds him of a real-world example of bacteria producing a detoxifying resource, where people have studied the evolution of producers and cheats, basically. And he's asking, are there any social structures in animals where similar strategies have been observed to emerge?
Well, so personality I mean, I usually give this talk to convince behavioral ecologists that you can understand personality what we call personality variation in ecology and evolution, which is basically, persistent individual differences in behavior. So where individuals kind of behaviorally specialize, and empirically, it's very well established that you see it everywhere. And actually, in social contexts and in social systems, you do see a lot of social differentiation. So you certainly do see the kind of the behavioral polarization that I talked about, but it's something that the basic models never really explained why we would see that outcome. So talking about these kind of dynamics, the reason we focus on these kind of simple dynamics is that there can be robust ways of generating the kind of observed behavioral specialization. You don't always see it, but you do tend to see it quite a lot. And also in the producer-scrounger, and in some of the empirical work on producer-scrounger games, you've also tend to see individuals that specialize. You have tended to see individuals that become specialist scroungers and individuals that are specialist producers once you run the experiment a few times. So they kind of match the kind of things that we're predicting. If you're repeatedly interacting with the same group of individuals, then and you're kind of adjusting your behavior on experience, then it's very theoretically we get this outcome all the time. It's very, very robust, and it's not just for producer-scrounger. We've also done it for any all of the kind of two action negative frequency dependent games that we typically analyze. We get, if you put reinforcement learning in them, you get the same outcome. So it's incredibly robust. So to sort of call a satellite, hawk dove, you get the same kind of thing with learning. So
that's, yeah, okay, lovely, perfect. Thank you so much. I am going to invite Damien and let me find everyone.
do I need to stop sharing my?
And I will, yes, if you could, that'd be great. I'm just multitasking a little bit. I'll invite Damien on the screen, and I'll also invite Dennis. There he is. And thank you, Sasha. I'm going to kick you out now, if that's okay. And we'll see you later on for the for the roundtable. Perfect. Hi, Damien. Great.
Hi.
And I hope that Dennis is going to be, yeah, perfect. Great. There we go.
Great. Could I start with my introduction? All right. So it's my pleasure to introduce Damien Farine. He is currently an Excellenza professor at the University of Zurich, and he is also an associate professor at the National University of Australia, and also affiliated to the Max Planck Institute for Animal Behavior in Constance. And Damien really has a vast experience and a really large body of research working with many different animals that show very interesting collective behaviors. He started out doing his PhD at the University of Oxford, working with, I think, with great tits, and studied their collective behaviors. Before then joining University of California, Davis, to study the collective behavior of baboons. Before he then joined the University of Constance, as well as the Max Planck Institute and the Center of Advanced Studies of Collective Behavior, where he started working with guinea fowls, if I'm correct with this, and he's currently in his lab studying, continuing this research on guinea fowls, but also studying zebra finch as well as dolphins. And he will today talk about kind of the emulsion of this experience and body of research in these different animal species to draw connections between foraging theory and collective behavior, like what we can learn from principles in optimal foraging theory in terms of principles in collective behavior. So with that, please take it away, Damien.
Thanks.
Yes, feel free to share your screen.
Yeah, here you go. You can see that okay?
That's looking great. I'm going to, okay, that's
Good.
perfect. You go ahead, Damien. Thank you very much.
Well, thanks everyone for coming and sticking around. So yeah, as Dennis said, I'm going to talk to you about collective foraging in animal groups. And when we think about foraging decisions, we often think about these as behaviors of individuals. But for many species, decisions actually made as a group, with the emergent outcome of the group having impact on what individuals do. And this can then affect their future preferences as well. So today I'm going to start by focusing on foraging decisions made in this context, in a context where individuals are living in a group and they have to somehow resolve any disagreements about their preferences about what to do next, and rather than splitting up and doing different things. We can think of an analogy of this being that when you're together with some group of friends, you're having to decide about what restaurant to go to. First, you're not going to want to split up, so you'll have to somehow resolve this conflict among your friends and come up with some kind of compromise solution. And secondly, the decision that is made as a group might then have an impact on your own future decision. So imagine that you go with a different group of friends. On the following night, you might have changed your preference in order to avoid what you did the night before, or increase the strength of your preference from the night before because you already missed out on what you wanted to do once. So when we think about collective decision-making, we can look at this from a theoretical perspective, and we can take two different angles. We can ask, firstly, what kind of decisions groups should make. Okay, so I'm not going to give all of the background, but this is a whole bunch of game theoretic work done by Larissa Conrad. And she basically found that in general, groups should make democratic decisions. They should essentially vote for what to do. And this makes a lot of sense, because if you imagine that a group flicks a coin or follows just one individual in order to decide what to do next, then on average, individuals are not going to get to do what they want to do very often, but if they vote for the majority, then every time more than half, or at least half of the individuals get to do what they want to do. We can then ask about exactly how groups achieve this. And in a very influential paper by a model by Ian Cousin from 2005, he sort of simulated agents that were moving following some local interaction rules, and found that if he seeded some individuals in that group with in a group with some preferences, then you would get two kind of different outcomes. So here on the x-axis, we have the difference in the angles between the preferences that are the differences in the directions of the individuals that have preferences. And on the y-axis, you have the direction taken by the whole group as they go about making this decision. You kind of find two regimes here. What you find is that if the angle of the differences between two directions is relatively small, then the group actually averages the directions taken between the two preferences. And if the angle, so they go down the middle, kind of like this, right? So the y-axis is about half of the difference in the x-axis. And then, but if the difference is very large, then they will choose one direction versus the other. So it will actually sort of make a more binary decision. Right, so they'll choose one of this direction. When they choose which direction they should go, in line with what Larissa Conrad found, they should go with the majority preferences. Okay, so this kind of gives us a background to think about what animals should do when they're making decisions and then how they should go about it. I'm going to talk about this mostly empirically. I'm going to draw from the Guinea fowl project first, and then a little bit of theory, a little bit of computational work to sort of set some of the future directions of what we're trying to do. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about the dolphin system as well, partly because that's actually some of the most foraging kind of work we do. I don't actually work specifically on foraging that much. So first about the vulturine guinea fowl. So this is a group of vulturine guinea fowl at the Impala Research Center in the central Kenya in Laikipia. And I established this system in 2016 after having worked on baboons. And in my postdoc on baboons, we sort of tracked an entire group of baboons to really study with GPS, to study how they went about making decisions. And that was great, but we effectively had 30 days of data and only a single group. And while I was out there, it struck me that this species that, as you can see in this slide, they move extremely cohesively. They also walk everywhere, and they sort of navigate their way as groups across these very big landscapes. So it struck me as a really ideal system to really ask questions about collective movement, collective decision-making, and to also some extent foraging as well. What works really well with these groups is because they move together as a group, we can trap them all in these walk-in trap all at once, so we can catch entire groups all together. And then we can also fit individuals with unique combinations of color bands on their legs, in some cases some little wing tags on their wing as well, so that we can identify each individual in the population. And by uniquely marking all these individuals, we can then, my team in Kenya that are out there every day are going out and surveying who is hanging out with who. And we can build sort of a dynamic network of the social communities, or really the groups over time, as you can see here. So each of these sort of blocks is one different group in the different colors, and how they're sort of maintained over time. This is data going from about 2018 all the way up to the end of 2022. And you can see that these groups are staying relatively, or really quite stable over time, with some dynamics taking place, mostly when there's breeding happening. One of the really sort of exciting things about the system is that I thought there would be an ideal platform for putting solar-powered GPS tags. So these GPS tags, like you can see fitted on this individual here, collect a lot of sunshine, and they basically allow us to collect data on what birds do every single moment of every single day. And what we've done is, across about 20 different groups in the population, we fit GPS tag to several members of those groups. And here you'll see a small movie. This is just 1 day's worth of data that sort of illustrates the richness of what's going on. You'll see that there's a communal roost here where lots of different groups will come out of. You'll see that this group here is kind of temporarily split in two, and they'll re-find each other and join each other, and so on. This is, again, just a very short amount of data, just 1 day, and we get data like this every single day of the year. We usually have about 80 to 100 GPS tags at any one time. See here, this group has found each other again, and they'll redrawn back into the same roost again. And so collecting this data, the combination of the observational data and then the GPS data that told us where each of the birds was in this population allowed us to build a sort of social network, both within the groups and between the groups, and sort of discover that these birds live in what we call a multi-level society, so a society in which there are multiple social units of different tiers that come together and form together and disband, much like what has been found in primates and other humans. And this was actually the first description of this in the bird species as well. But maybe more interestingly for you guys, because we're thinking about foraging and collective decision-making, we also would put tags on entire groups at once. So both these birds actually have a GPS tag. You can just see the antennas sticking out of the other one, of the back of the other one, which allows us to collect data on simultaneously on what every member of the group is doing. And we can study situations like this. Again, this is the whole group. This is just a very small area. You can see the size of a small building here. And the group will sort of make a collective movement in one direction. At some point, you get a disagreement about which direction to go for. Some members of the group want to go, sort of keep going northeast, and the other birds want to go to the southeast. Oh, I don't know why the movie didn't play completely. Oops. See if I can try again. Oh, I was going to stop there. Anyways, so this is the situation in which they sort of find themselves in, and the entire group stops. And what we find here is, of course, there's these two different directions. So going back to the theory, we see that theory suggests that in this sort of situation where the directions are very different, the group should choose one direction versus the other. And what we see is exactly that. In this case, we see this group, this little subgroup, basically giving up its preference and following and rejoining the other group to move in the original direction taken by the other group. And this is just one example of this, but with over 100 days of data from these several groups like this, we can build a similar sort of heat map of what the guinea fowl do on the lots and lots of different ones of these different types of these decisions. And the result looks like this, which is almost an exact match of what is predicted by the theory. And what's kind of exciting by this is actually in my postdoc, we'd done exactly the same thing with the baboons, and we'd found exactly the same thing again. So, using the same approach in the two completely different systems, we're finding some very strong similarities in terms of how groups are making decisions. Now, you'll notice also that in this case, it seems to be there was quite an uneven balance of the number of individuals. And what we could look also is which of these two subgroups was more likely to win. And again, like predicted by theory, we found that it was much more likely that the larger of the two groups was more likely to win. And again, it wasn't super strong, this effect in the guinea fowl, much stronger in the baboons. And so both systems seem to use a majority rule in terms of deciding which of the directions to take. So how do we scale this up to understand how this fits within a broader environment? So together with Grace Davis and Meg Crowfoot at the Max Planck, we just published a paper proposing that one solution that we might have to studying these kinds of decisions and quantifying the conflicts of interest that take place within these decisions and how that relates to the environment is actually through optimal foraging theory, much like what Sasha just talked about. Specifically, we can take the marginal value theorem. So Sasha had a small plot of this. I'll explain it a little bit more. So what we have is along the x-axis, we have time, and we have the departure time in searching for food, and this is the travel time here. And when individuals enter a patch, this is for an individual, they accumulate food with some decreasing rate. And at some point, they could choose any point along this time to leave the patch, If they leave too early, of course, they will have the average rate of food that they will take across the environment will be relatively low. If they leave too late, it'll be low a little bit more, but not quite as much as it could be. And effectively, there's an optimal time in which they can leave the patch, which is a point at which the current rate matches the maximum rate of the environment. And leaving at any time, either before this, which is important, or after this, introduces some opportunity cost. Right? So this is basically energy or food that they could have taken, that they could have acquired either in a future patch by foraging faster or by staying in the same patch instead of having left. And so individuals should make decisions based on this by departing at this optimal time. Now, if we have a group of individuals, right, we extend this idea to the fact that we actually have multiple individuals foraging together, and they're making decisions as a group, so they arrive in the patch together and they have to leave the patch together, and then this raises some interesting situations. First, if all of the groups are exactly identical, then what is particularly interesting is that the optimal departure time for each of the group members is, of course, the same, but it's actually identical to that of the entire group combined. So the top line is the combined group intake, and the dashed line is each of the individuals' group intake rates, intake curves. And so in theory, foragers can be optimal when foraging as groups. But actually what happens in reality is that there's a lot of differences within the group. Now, as Sasha talked about, in terms of the different traits that individuals have, of course, we have, within most wild animal groups, we have a lot of differences like body size and dominance and so on, which can affect the rate at which individuals can accrue resources out of the patch. And it'll, of course, then translate to having differences in their accumulation curves. And so what we find is that foraging as a group, in theory, should introduce some individual level consensus cost. Okay, so whenever the group leaves along this continuum of time from when the group enters to the point it leaves, there's going to be some opportunity cost paid by some of the individuals within that group. So in the paper, we propose that this optimal foraging allows us to also quantify these opportunity costs and to really better understand and make predictions about what kind of decisions groups make. But one of the interesting things that we also did is we quantified how changes in the environment would affect the intensity of these opportunity costs. So if you imagine that we took this travel time and we made the travel time larger or smaller, it'll change the gradient of these curves, and it'll push the lines either further to the right or closer to the left. And we could ask, how does the environment drive within group conflict? And what we find is something like this, which is basically if the travel time is very small, then actually there's very little conflict within the group, because most individuals basically just want to arrive, they forage really quickly, and they want to leave again almost straight away. But as the travel time increases, this consensus cost increases until it reaches some point in which it then starts to decrease, because every individual basically just wants to stay in the patch for as long as there's food in the patch. And what this tells us is that the amount of conflict within a group should actually be lowest either when conditions are very good, not very rich, which makes sense, or actually somewhat paradoxically when the conditions are very, very poor. And right now, for those of you who might be familiar, Kenya is experiencing one of the worst droughts in the last century. In our field site, our birds have not bred since, in any meaningful way, since 2018, and there's almost no vegetation, and we're getting huge amounts of death at the moment. Except luckily, it rained last night for the first time in several months. But in our population out here, as well as capturing GPS data to see where animals go, in some of the individuals, we also collect accelerometer data. So accelerometer is like a 3-axis sensor that tells us about acceleration in different directions. And when you look at the signal of the accelerometer data, you can see that there are different sort of signatures to the signal based on the different types of behaviors that the bird is doing. This is something that's been fairly well established across a number of different systems. And so we can use deep machine learning methods to classify this accelerometer signal into the relative behaviors. And so Charlotte, a postdoc in the group, has been studying sort of five of the key state behaviors, which is about 80% of the behavior of the animals. And at the moment, this is still work in progress, we're getting sort of about 80% accuracy in terms of classifying the accelerometer data into the correct behavior. And what she's been doing, she sort of did just, thankfully for this talk, she prepared just an example of just one bird in a period towards at the start of the drought. And what you see here is each of the behaviors, sort of the total activity budget across the different hours of the morning. And what happens with the guinea fowl is that they basically get up in the morning, they forage early, but at some point the temperature starts to increase and they retreat into the vegetation. And they're an interesting system to study for foraging because most of their food is out in the open, but being out in the open is costly during the day because they go into hypothermia. So we also have data from temperature loggers, internal temperature loggers that show this. But also after about 9 o'clock is when the main predator, the martial eagle, also wakes up or gets up and starts to forage for themselves. And so we see sort of so after 9 a.m., 10 o'clock onwards, you basically get a big drop in foraging. It sort of varies from day to day and so on, and you get more resting and preening and so on. Now, if we look during the drought, we can see that in these last 3 hours of the morning, we see a really big increase in foraging. And so we're hoping to use this, and this is just very preliminary data, but we're hoping to start using this to study some of the dynamics of what groups are facing and how groups are resolving these challenges during droughts. And interestingly, it's also during these droughts that we see the largest aggregation of birds. So in the middle of this very big drought, we would see 3, 4, 5 different groups, a total of sometimes 300 or more individuals, all moving together day after day after day. And what's happening here, which I think is very interesting, is that the groups are not only staying together, but somehow making decisions about where to go, despite the fact that there are so many individuals and so many different groups involved. But they're also it's resulting in them really synchronizing their behaviors together. And so in the second bit of this talk, which I hope I have enough time, I want to talk a little bit more about the importance of synchronizing behavior for foraging. And for this, we're going to go to southern Brazil in a place called Laguna. So if you went to the mouth of the estuary of the Laguna system, you would come across these traditional artisanal fishers, net casting fishers that stand on the edge of this sort of channel. This is an edge where it gets suddenly very deep to water. And they might be waiting there for quite some time, but they're not actually waiting there for any old fish. What they're doing is they're waiting there for some dolphins to turn up. And these dolphins basically come and the idea is that these dolphins herd the fish towards the shore, towards these net casting fishers, and seemingly give them a cue on when to cast their nets. And this is kind of one of these cue looks like, so they can bob their head out and they can do these deep sudden dives. But what hasn't really ever been figured out is exactly how this coordination or this seeming cooperation works. And what I'm going to show you is that actually it's the temporal synchronization of behavior that's really the key to the success for both the dolphins and the fishes. So we studied this using a multi-platform system that we developed that allowed us to combine data of what's happening both above the water and underwater simultaneously. And we used a range of different analytical tools, such as deep learning and so on, to extract information from these data sets. Here's an example of the underwater footage combined with the above water footage and how they synchronize over time. So you see here quickly the school of mullet going past. The dolphin has just given its cue, and in this case, the fish has cast their net, but they just missed the school of mullet. When we talk about these different cues that the dolphins give, we can talk about basically there are a number of different cues, but there are basically 4 different scenarios in which the interaction can take place. And the most important is when they synchronize their behavior. So the dolphins give the cue, and the fishes cast their nets at the right time in response to the cue. This accounts for about half of all the casting events that were recorded. There are some cases, about a third of the time, when the fishes misread the cue, so they either miss the dolphin or they get a bit excited and then they cast the net a little bit too early. There are cases where they cast the net without any cue at all, so the dolphin is just hanging around and the fishes just cast the net for a bit because they think there might be some fish. And there are some cases in which the fishes miss the cue altogether and they never cast their net. So using the underwater data, we could look at the sort of fish density that existed and around each of these net casting events. And what we found is it's really just in the situations in which there's a synchronization between the two that we could really see a big timely peak in the number of fish detected close to the fishermen. Sometimes, if they misread the cue, what we can see sometimes that you do get a peak, but it's either too late or too early. If there's no cue, then usually it means there's no fish. And again, if there's a cue but no net, it's a bit ambiguous. So what we draw from this is that basically the dolphins are pushing these schools of fish, which you can see here, in towards where the fishes are and telling them when the fish are there, and the fish and the dolphins and the fishes cast their net in response. And this really has a big impact on the fish's success. And so this is, if we look at when they catch fish almost only when there's cues and almost never when there are no cues. I'll come back to this slide a little bit towards the end. We can see that the dolphins also react to the fish's behavior. So using underwater hydrophones, we recorded the sort of foraging behavior of the dolphins. Also, we see it a little bit in the video. And what we see is situations like this, where this is kind of before the cue, the dolphins are doing some sparse echolocations, and then they're sort of increasing that as they come in to the cue. They go silent, and at some point they make these terminal buzzes, which are really correspond to fine, very close foraging, homing in on prey. If we look at the sort of reaction to these foraging clicks, we sort of identified these high intensity foraging clicks. What we found is that they typically only happened after the dolphin gave a cue and the fishes responded at the right time. So I didn't show you the other plots, but basically the red is just on 0 in all of the other plots. So the dolphins are really only doing these foraging buzzes in situations when the fishes are responding correctly with their net casts. But what you see here is there's a little bit of a delay, right, between when the cue event is taking place and when they really start hitting the peak of this foraging. And we can see that again in this video here. If you look at the timeline, the sort of match time when nets are being cast, the dolphins are being silent. At some point, they start their terminal buzzers when the nets have sunk. And what we found is that this matches almost exactly the amount of time it takes for the net to sink to the bottom. And one of the ways that we discovered that the dolphins are getting food and they're benefiting is that they're basically going into the nets and taking the fish. So what you see here is, it's a bit hard to see, but you see, I'll show it again. What you'll see is the net coming down over the fish, and then the dolphin coming in between the fish, between the net and the sand, and kicking up a whole bunch of sand and getting it. So here's the dolphin coming in through here. That's the tail of the dolphin there. I can also show you this in slow-mo. So this is the dolphin approaching as the net is coming. This is just a layer right just above the bottom of the channel. The mullet are trapped in the net and the dolphin is going in after the fish. So just to finish, I want to come back to this slide about fish's success. And one of the key things that we found is sort of there you saw just that there were lots of, before you saw there were lots of red dots in this slide and no in this graph and no or very few red dots in the other. But along the x-axis here, we also quantified the sort of propensity of fish or the suitability of the conditions for producing fish for fishes. And what we found is that when the dolphins synchronized with the fishes, they basically almost removed the reliance of the fishes on good conditions for catching fish. So the dolphins were able to produce kind of catches for fishes, even when the conditions weren't particularly good, because the tide was wrong or the wind was wrong, and so on. So in summary, I just want just to summarize my talk, basically, we think that shared decisions are likely to be common. This is both predicted by theory, but also by a number of different systems that have found this, including 2 of my own. The resource distribution also has an impact on conflict. I didn't get a chance to show you, but we also did some work, some experiments with the guinea fowls to look at leadership and how the individuals who led the group from one patch to another was impacted by the distribution of resources within the patches, such as if they're really dense rich patches versus more dispersed patches. And also we should expect that over in environments, the sort of more distributed the resources are, the less conflict actually we should see within groups. That the environmental conditions can impact these foraging rates, and we see this in droughts, that the birds are having to forage much more into the more dangerous times of the day in order to get the food that they need. And that synchronization in behavior can reduce environmental sensitivity or sensitivity to environmental conditions. With that, I'd like to just finish by first thanking my team in Kenya. This is Wisma and Brenda, who've been with us for nearly 5 years now, running every day the data collection. Awesome team in Zurich, and the group that will hopefully in future be able to also thank the group in Australia that is being established there. A lot of funding agencies have really supported this work, especially all of our work at the moment is funded by the European Research Council, which has given us 5 years to really collect some amazing data. And with that, thank you for inviting me.
Thanks so much, Damien. That was excellent, really interesting stuff. So we'll ask you a couple of questions now. So Alex Kachelnik has a question for you about the guinea fowl experiments. And he is wondering if you have any estimates of gain curves in the guinea fowls. Are they nicely concave? And can you parameterize the MBT models?
Thanks. Hi, Alex. Long time no see. We haven't actually done this for the guinea fowl per se. It's something that we should do. The tricky thing with the guinea fowl is that what they eat is so tiny that it's really, really difficult for us to see when they're actually swallowing food versus when they're just pecking at the ground. And unlike many of the other species, so unlike the helmeted guinea fowl that scratches at the ground to find food, the vulturine guinea fowl sort of dig at the ground. So they're always sort of hitting the ground at one time. But Grace, who did her PhD, she was the first author on this paper. Actually, part of her PhD was quantifying this with groups of capuchin monkeys. And when capuchin monkeys eat on these fruiting bodies of one of the big palms in Panama, she took photos of all the palms to quantify make an estimate of how much food there was, and she could really, in very careful detail, record all of the pieces of fruit that were taken by each of the individuals in the group. And she also went down underneath the trees and looked at what was discarded by the group, so she could quantify also some degree of the amount of food that they were taking, not including the discards. And she found that the results, it's almost like when you aggregate it, at least at the group level, you get an almost perfect concave result as predicted by the marginal value theorem. So we're still analyzing the data. She sort of had to wrap up her PhD and so on. So hopefully she'll get to sort of quantify that a little bit more. It's of course noisier when it's in the wild like that, because there's a bit of queuing for getting onto the patches and so on. So we also have to sort of think about how that affects the predictions of the model.
And we have a question from Rory, and actually I was wondering this actually a little bit as well. He says, amazing talk. Is there an influence of social hierarchy in the decision of the bird's group direction? Yes, I was wondering, I was going to phrase it in terms of pecking order. But yes, yeah, I was curious about that as well, yeah. Yeah,
I actually had a whole bunch of slides on this, but I had to take them out because I didn't have enough time. I couldn't decide on what to talk about. In both the guinea fowl and in the baboons, we effectively found that any individual can lead. In the guinea fowl, so reference this a little bit briefly, we did do some experiments where we allowed them to forage on different types of patches. On some patches where the food was really aggregated, and some patches where the food was really distributed. And we found that what happens is actually the interactions on the patch predicted who would end up leading. And when the food is really aggregated, the dominant individuals would monopolize the patch and they would chase out the subordinates. And the subordinates would initiate movements. So when sort of enough subordinates were displaced from the patch, they would initiate movement, which actually caused all the dominants to have to abandon the patch in order to stay with the group. And so we could basically found that this seemed to be a mechanism that allowed these subordinates to sort of escape these conditions in which they were in a patch that was really suboptimal for them.
Interesting. Okay. Sorry, I'm multitasking a little bit here. I'm going to invite Dennis back on because he has a question for you. And in the meanwhile, I'll also ask Charlotte Roche's question. She says, both very interesting talks. I'm thinking about your guinea fowl data in an ecosystem context. Do you think guinea fowl predators could also be suffering from the poorer environments, leading the guinea fowl prey to group together more?
Yeah, this is it's a fascinating thing. And I think about this really a lot, is how this is a multi-trophic optimal foraging problem with both the guinea fowl responding to their environment in terms of the resources, but then of course that's changing how they respond is of course also changing the resource for the predators and so on. We do have some martial eagles, the predators that are also GPS tagged. Unfortunately, it's only 2, so our ability to conclude very much from them is not necessarily going to be so great. But we, one day we might get to analyzing those data and thinking about that. Of course, they also forage over a much, much larger area than just our population. And actually, one of the things that we're discovering in Kenya, which is a bit challenging, talking about the ecosystem, is how drought is affecting the system. And what's happening is that more and more we're seeing that environmental heterogeneity is in a really small scale. Okay, so within the range of where a martial eagle can hunt, you will get some places that have had quite a lot of rain and some places that have had no rain at all. Just, it's only 10 kilometers away or 5 kilometers away, but these single rain clouds can just completely change the environment. And so you get these hugely patchy environments. And this is what these groups of guinea fowl are doing. They're basically aggregating up as 200-300 birds, and they're going out in search of places where there's been rain to find some resources.
Thank you. So I invited everyone else back on screen just so we can sort of, I think there are still a few more questions for you, Damien, but I think we can also start thinking about questions for both Damien and Sasha. But Dennis, did you want to go ahead and ask your question?
I had a specific question to ask for Damien. So first of all, really exciting data and also very impressive videos that you have taken from the dolphin fisherman interactions. I was very intrigued by the idea of these bifurcations that occur when you have small deviations versus larger deviations within the group decision options. I'm wondering, in terms of you having studied these kind of questions in different animal species, do you see any kind of conservation of where this bifurcation occurs, or are there potential external or internal factors that could influence where this bifurcation exactly happens?
Yeah, super cool question actually. And I was really struck in the guinea fowl and in the baboons. It's extremely similar. It's a bit sensitive, of course, to how much data we have. We had several groups in the guinea fowl, and one of the groups didn't have quite as much data as the other. So, it didn't give. Funny thing, it gave much more precise result. Actually, it was much more imprecise because of few data. But on the group that we had a lot of data, we also looked at. Well, the PhD student Dana, who did this as one of her chapters, looked at the group in different contexts. So when they were out on these open areas and glades versus when they're in vegetation and so on. She found that it seemed to be highly conserved across different environmental conditions. So N equals very little, right? But maybe as more people engage with using GPS and whole groups, we might see more replication of this. And so at least it's something that's feasibly repeatable in lots of different systems.
Yeah, thank you.
And
yeah, I'm wondering, sorry. I'm just wondering, the baboons and the guinea fowls, they roughly live in a similar environment, right? In terms of the vegetation and like potentially also what kind of like foraging statistics they would occur in the environment, right?
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I mean, I thought that the guinea fowl, one reason I decided to invest in the system, because I thought there would be an interesting sort of parallel to the baboons in the sense of a similar species that's living in very big groups and it's facing very much the same sort of environmental challenges as the baboon. So that was really one of the motivating factors. And of course, there are lots and lots of other species. There are many that are solitary and so on. So we can't just pretend that this is a pretty perfect picture, right? But it's also, where the long-term superb starling group do their work and so on. I think that they're also doing a lot of these kinds of things as well. So.
Dean, I think you also had one more question for Damien, and I'm also mindful that we should sort of ask maybe some broader questions, I guess, as well. Or, but Dean, you go ahead, and then I might ask a question for both of you guys, if that's okay.
Yeah, thanks. My question is actually inspired by Sasha's talk, but for Damien. I was wondering how, when you have a consensus decision in a group, it can possibly be seen as a single producer moving off, finding a new patch, and the rest of the group being scroungers that follow it, versus being, say, a consensus choice that is a democratic decision. And I was wondering, if it was a democratic decision, you would probably observe a longer time before decisions are made with the groups. So I wondered, with the guinea fowl, as the groups get longer in these drought conditions, are you observing longer times before traveling between patches or not?
So we haven't, I completely agree. And we haven't looked at this so much along the variation of group sizes, because but we found some differences according to group size, like the range size and so on. So we seem to have like an optimal group size in terms of maximizing the use of space. But we haven't looked at it precisely this, but we did, one of the PhD students in my group studied dispersal, and in the dispersing birds, he found that when they're making these long distance movements, they engage in this kind of like very directed, much faster movements, which is actually much more energetically efficient. He could quantify the energy efficiency gains, which almost completely offset the transport costs of dispersing. And then he applied the same sort of idea to groups. And what we found, or what he found, is that the that groups, even though they're able to be a little bit more efficient when they're making large-scale movements, when they're displacing, like when they're leaving their home range to go search for resources outside their home range, and they're getting nowhere near what individuals are able to get. So there is some sort of slowing effect that is probably being caused, by situations like where part of the group wants to splinter off in a different direction, and the whole group has to slow down and sort of reconcile that decision and move off again. And so in doing that, they're basically not able to, they're able to move as straight as what individuals are, which is one of the key efficiency characteristics, but they can't sort of achieve the same continued increase in speed over space. So kind of getting at an answer to your question.
I was curious how you both feel, so to speak, as you both very kindly sort of partly framed your talks around MBT or optimal foraging and ideas in those contexts. And I'm wondering about either coming from a sort of theoretical perspective or coming from a perspective of seeing a lot of like real world data, like how useful you think MBT is in that sort of in these contexts, because I think you both sort of push it in different directions beyond sort of it as a descriptive, let's say, rule, for example, into different realms. And for example, Sasha, you mentioned reinforcement learning also being quite useful in some aspects. And I'm just wondering whether you think that it still has this sort of continued utility to describe behavior in these terms, or yes, I guess it's a very broad question, I'm afraid, but I'm sort of curious on your thoughts about in that direction.
Who do you want to go first? Me. Okay. Well, I'm a a committed adaptationist from a kind of philosophical perspective. Not that I believe everything is adaptive, I don't, but I view taking these kind of adaptationist approaches, of which optimal foraging theory was the original kind of iteration, and illustrated how you can use it to take this approach. I think is a very powerful way of hypothesizing about evolution, about evolutionary outcomes. So I'm committed to that, and so from that perspective, because it's not that you expect it all to be true and you expect all of your predictions to be hit quantitatively perfectly, but the key thing is it organizes your thoughts well. It allows you to make very uncompromising and easily interpretable predictions about what you expect to observe under certain conditions, and then where it fails that then allows you to extract quite a lot of information about what's going on in your system from where it fails. So for me, it's an efficient way of proceeding scientifically, because it has this kind of deductive quality that a lot of other kind of theoretical approaches, I guess, that we use out there, they have it to a certain degree, but they don't. But not. It's not as powerful and as central to biology, in my opinion. So, I mean, I'm talking more broadly in terms of using game theory and optimization approaches to theorize about biological diversity, if you like, not just behavior. And I see optimal foraging theory as something that still remains useful, because people stopped working on foraging problems, non-social foraging problems, pretty abruptly in behavioral ecology, before all of the theory had been tested. So I think there's a lot of stuff that can still be done, and still left to be done. And also the basic logic applies outside of foraging, as I hope I kind of illustrated a little bit. I didn't give you the other kind of non-foraging context examples that we've worked through too, but the basic logic applies in those situations too. So yeah, I mean, I still think there's a value to taking the kind of fundamental approach that's at the heart of optimal foraging. Now, there's a caveat here. I don't know that just spending all of our time analyzing optimal diet problems and marginal value theorem problems is a useful kind of practice for a large number of people, to encourage people to do that. I think there has been a lot of work done to test a lot of these ideas, the fundamentals of these ideas. Now, I'm not 100% sure how it's used in neuroscience. I mean, this is the fascinating thing about talking in this context, is I don't really kind of understand exactly how they're using kind of optimal foraging theory in kind of non-behavioral contexts, but certainly at a behavioral level, analyzing other things, other problems, taking the same approach all the way. I mean, that's what my career has been, basically, is taking the basics of what I did during my PhD and just applying it, with a few more wrinkles to wider and wider number of problems. If that makes sense.
I don't have much, I guess, to add, but I think what I appreciate about the marginal models like the marginal value theorem is also that they can point out relatively simple rules that individuals can make that give them to solve fairly complex problems, such as understanding what the environment, or the sort of how to navigate an environment. And so the rule is just basically like stop foraging when you feel like you're not getting enough relative to what you've had in the past, kind of thing. And I think these are very attractive. And I mean, I love the marginal value theorem because I teach it to undergrads and I sort of talk about it and I say, why should we care about this model that's now 50 years old? And then we can basically cast it in a different context and get some really interesting insights. Not necessarily answers, but insights in different areas. So I think that appeals to the students quite a bit as well.
Well, interestingly, from a marginal value theorem perspective, it was originally formulated in two different contexts, right? In behavioral ecology, it was formulated in a patch use food foraging context, but it was also formulated by Jeff Parker in a mating context, where he was using it to understand, you know, the dynamics of male dung flies on dung pats, you know, how long they should hang around on dung pats. So it was formally derived simultaneously, or more or less simultaneously, in these two different contexts. So yeah, the logic, you know, just to echo what we both said, is like, you know, even from the beginning, the basic logic, you know, was recognized, it was broadly applicable. I just think the sexual selection world went away from these kind of models and then came back, if you like. But yeah.
Thank you. It's really interesting to hear your perspectives. I don't know, I'm always kind of curious when we have such different, you know, guests on, so to speak. Rory, I think you had a question.
Yes, thanks. Yeah, so great talk. Thank you both. I was thinking through both the talks a bit about kind of the interplay or kind of tension between like learning and evolution in this cases. So, for example, Sasha, in your talk, I was trying to kind of get my head around whether these the stabilization of these strategies is driven by learning, and at what point and how might these strategies actually kind of evolve and become genetically fixed. And then I also kind of, just to like the second part of the question, I wonder if I could apply that a little bit to Damien, your example of the dolphins foraging. Like, do we know to what extent these strategies are just a kind of cultural phenomenon, or is there evidence of some kind of genetic adaptation at that level? So, a bit of a mouthful of a question.
The first part of the question is definitely yours, Sasha.
Sure, but why don't you go first on the second bit, and then I'll.
Yeah. Okay. It's a really interesting thing, and something that we discuss quite a lot, because the default sort of idea is that it's of course culturally learned, and so on, and you know, probably, you know, from mother to offspring through vertical learning, and that's sort of where most cetacean folks come in. I've come into the system completely as a non-cetacean folk and really wanting to learn more about the mechanisms of how it happens. And I actually believe there's more competition going on. I think that there's about 60 dolphins in this population. It's pretty stable at that amount, and only have about half of them engage in the cooperative behavior, and half of them don't. But this sort of individual's engagement changes a little bit from year to year. And some individuals come in and then they leave again, and so on. Some do it a lot more, some do it less. And so in my opinion, there's probably some degree of, again, frequency dependence, or some competition in the sense of like how much it pays to sort of invest in this kind of foraging tactic versus alternative foraging sources.
Yeah, so interesting that you asked that question, because it was the bit that I didn't get a chance to go into. We have kind of thought about the evolutionary consequences of the developmental outcomes that I discussed. I did describe the kind of the development of behavior dynamics, which tends to lead otherwise identical individuals to polarize their behavior if they spend time together in these competitive social contexts where payoffs to doing things are negatively frequency dependent. Okay, and what happens is, if you like, just to borrow kind of Dave Stevens's term, developmental stable strategy, the developmental outcome where you've got this kind of strong polarization that happens under some circumstances. What happens at that stage, though, is that even though it kind of gets to the kind of roughly ESS proportions of behavior that you expect, it's at that point, actually, even though there's no incentive to deviate based on like, if you were a producer in that, at that equilibrium, it didn't pay, if you tried to scrounge, your reinforcement would be low, and so you wouldn't be encouraged to scrounge, and you'd go back to producing. But what's happening is that, and this is true for all of these kind of games, is that you can identify one of the strategies as being more pro-social and the other strategy as being more anti-social, relatively speaking. So in the producer-scrounger game, the producer is more pro-social strategy, and the scrounger is the more anti-social strategy. Hawk-dove game, hawk is more anti-social, dove is more pro-social. And at equilibrium, even though there's no incentive to defect, you're still getting a lower payoff if you're specializing as a pro-social player. Okay, what that does actually is it generates selection on biases in the learning process. So genetic tendencies in, kind of way that you might wire up your learning, the kind of mechanisms underlying reinforcement learning, such that you should overvalue the reinforcement that you get from the antisocial strategies. Okay, so that you avoid getting stuck as a pro-social player when everything polarizes. Okay, but the problem with that is it sets up a negative frequency dependence, so you end up with diversification, genetic diversification in biases. So in this sense, in this way, you're getting this kind of example, and it's very general to all of these kind of social contexts with negative frequency dependence, where you've got two actions. We get this kind of very strong similar results. You do get this setup that this learning dynamic generates some consistent outcome over generational time that then selects for, genetic diversification. We're currently preparing a manuscript where we're kind of talking about this in much more detail, and disruptive selection, fitness minima, lots of complicated things that we'll go into in lots of detail there. But the bottom line is that this is an example, and Mary Jane West Eberhardt, in her Plasticity and Evolution book, Magnus Opus, in 2003, she talks a lot about learning setting the stage for evolutionary change. And it's been recognized in some contexts, and quite well established in some contexts. But these contexts that we're currently exploring suggest that, there are broader contexts where learning is going to have, or is likely to have, fairly kind of strong effects on evolutionary dynamics. These are phenotypic gambit selection only analyses. So of course you need the genetic conditions for the selection to operate in the way that we predict. But that's what I like about taking this approach, is that it just tells you that there'll be a pressure, and whether the system can respond to the pressure will depend on the details of the system. If that will make sense.
Thank you. So I think we're going to have to wrap up soon. I was just going to check in with Dean, just in case, because you're our guest, panelist, just in case you have a short question. No pressure. If you don't, it's fine. It's not a problem. But if you did, then this is your one and only chance.
So I'm going to cheat here and ask a slight collective behavior-oriented question, but it's relevant. So Damien, with the guinea fowl, you have high fidelity data of these individuals interacting in a group with each other. And Sasha, you've looked at how the learning and the behavior changes on small world networks, which allow you to change a regime of parameters and with it change things like the clustering coefficient. I'm wondering if there are respectively observed and optimal ranges of rates of interactions and clustering coefficients that you find in these behavior networks that might, for example, optimize the total, in the optimal case, maybe optimize the minimizing the energy expenditure from foraging, while at the same time having each individual behave selfishly in optimizing whether they're a producer or the word's not coming to me, producer or scrounger.
Yeah, sorry, wouldn't unmute. Yeah, interesting question. It's really challenging. I would say my observation on this would be to say that what we found in the few times where we've kind of looked at dynamics across different types of networks is that the mode of transmission and the problem that's trying to be solved can have a really big impact on the sort of relative performance, if you could so to speak, of the different network configurations. So, for example, we looked at sort of cultural evolution on social networks, and there's this hypothesis that, for example, like multi-level societies where you get this highly embedded social networks that are interconnected with each other would be better for cultural evolution. And actually what we found is it's not so clear as that. Intuitively, we thought the same thing, right? But what happens is that when you have too much of that separation, then you get too many of the behaviors going extinct and not so many opportunities for recombination of different behaviors in order to produce new products. But if you have the network being too connected, then all the different bits of information all go flying around the network too fast, and it gets sort of overwhelmed by typically one behavior or the other. So again, you lose out on some behaviors. So it's a kind of a bit of a balance, and what is actually most optimal for, in that case, cultural evolution, it really depended on how much transmission was taking place versus how much sort of use and recombination of information was taking place. So the relative balance of these things was having a really stronger effect than the actual network, and it was determining the relative performance of different networks. So yeah, I don't think from my perspective, I don't think there's one sort of universal optimal.
Okay, and so from a strictly kind of theoretical perspective, depends what you mean by optimal. If you're talking about like maximizing individual fitness, that's all. I mean, all of our analysis are ESS analyses. So within the context of whatever kind of set of parameters, optimum has been found, and the game theoretic optimum has been found in the way that I described it. But if you're talking like maximizing mean fitness of the mean productivity of the groups, then there are probably, what I didn't get a chance to get into is so the tighter the network, so that if you're only interacting with a few individuals, then you get very strong negative frequency dependent feedbacks, and this polarization is very strong. This leads to the outcomes that I talked about, selection for biases. All of that actually decreases population mean fitness, because if you've got all of because basically what you're getting is like a big chunk of individuals are consistently paying a fitness cost because they're stuck as the pro-social strategy, if you like, while where you have everybody interacting with everybody else, and you've got the non-polarization outcomes that we get, then you're getting more generalized behavior. And not that we've done it, we haven't looked at population mean fitness, but my intuition is that in those situations where you get less polarization, then the mean kind of productivity of the group is higher, if you like. So yeah, but at an individual level, I mean, fitness is being maximized. I guess you could also analyze what the individual. I'll stick with my initial interpretation. Okay, I haven't looked at this question formally, but that would be my intuition for the interesting question.
Okay, I think we should probably wrap it up there. But thank you so much, Damien and Sasha, for your wonderful talks, and for this discussion afterwards as well. We've really enjoyed it. And thanks, Dean, also for joining us. And of course, my fellow co-organizers. I will say our next episode is nearer the end of April. I'm not entirely sure if we've settled on a date yet. It's either the 11th or the 18th of April. Yes, but please join us. 18th. Thank you, Rory. Sorry. So please join us then to talk about marine foraging, I believe. Thanks everyone again for joining us, and hopefully see you then.
Thanks for inviting. It's been fun. Cheers.
Thanks a lot. Bye.